Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this museum conversation. We will go ahead and get started in just a minute. Give everyone a few moments to just log in and get your audio situated.
You look just like your picture, Christopher. At least on my screen, that's what I'm seeing. You looking like your picture.
Yeah, I guess so.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this conversation that's related to our special exhibition, Field Language, the painting and poetry of Warren and Jane Rohr. Before we go ahead and get started and I pass it over to Professor Reed to introduce our speakers, I want to remind you all of an upcoming event on April 1st that is another museum conversation related to this exhibition. So go ahead and mark your calendars for that. And some exciting news to share. On March 31st, the exhibition will reopen. So you can be sure to visit the Palmer's website and reserve your timed ticket starting March 31st to see the exhibition in person if you're inspired after our conversation today. I will also be moderating the Q&A throughout today's conversation, so please go ahead and submit any questions that come up using the Q&A feature on the Zoom bar that you can find at the bottom of your Zoom menu. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to one of the guest curators of this exhibition, Distinguished Professor of English, Visual Culture, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, Professor Christopher Reed.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and everybody. I want to welcome you to this afternoon's event. As art historians, we know that putting the experience of visual art into words is a difficult, possibly even an impossible project. But we're going to undertake that this afternoon, and I think we are lucky to be in very good hands with this. For the catalog to our exhibition, available from Penn State Press and at the museum, Nancy and Christopher collaborated on a beautiful essay titled Work, Labor, Matter, about Warren Rohr's abstraction. In the essay, they found the right words to discuss our visual experience of Warren Rohr's paintings, focusing on the interplay of the physical materiality of the paint with the evocation of evanescent atmospheres, the foregrounding of the labor that went into creating and maintaining this balance. All of that is there in their essay. And their accomplishment in that essay comes out of rich experience. Nancy Locke teaches courses here at Penn State in modern European art and the history of photography. She's written about all the heavy hitters with books and an exhibition catalog on Edouard Manet, articles on Paul Cézanne, and I know that a few years ago I heard her lecture in a truly revelatory way about Picasso. Christopher Campbell is an artist. In some ways, I just want to leave it there because that's really all you need to know. But I'll go further and explain that his art is deeply engaged with the natural world and its representation in pigment and gesture. In his youth, Christopher studied with the legendary photographer Ansel Adams in Yosemite, and later he worked closely with the renowned abstract expressionist painter Joan Mitchell in France. Today, he lives here in State College, where he draws quite literally from the local environment in his art. He works outside year-round, sometimes using natural materials such as sticks and leaves to create marks that reflect on the textures, the colors, the movements of plants in the wild of the natural environment. He also continues to work in photography in innovative ways, treating the camera in motion as another tool to draw with. And his art has been exhibited widely in China, Ireland, Spain, and various sites in the United States. Like Warren and Jane Rohr, Christopher and Nancy are part of a lifelong partnership with one another. The conversation that they will include us in this afternoon is an ongoing one between them, and I am sure we are privileged to be able to drop in on this talk about fundamental issues in modern painting that they'll be offering us today. With that, let me give you Nancy Locke and Christopher Campbell.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. And I want to stress this really is a conversation. It's not a formal lecture. So I hope you'll take advantage of the opportunity to type a question into the Q&A or chat window, whichever you see on your screen, and we hope to get to those questions later. But we're going to really leave this as a kind of back and forth, and we're going to talk about Rohr's development, but really look closely at the paintings that we've chosen. So with that, I'm going to do the screen share thing and pull up our presentation here. So Christopher and I were invited to contribute to the catalog, which I want to stress is a beautiful and really intellectually diverse publication that is looking at Jane Rohr's poetry as well as Warren Rohr's painting in many different lights, including the agricultural, including an essay on Amish quilts and so forth. But we were invited really to look closely at the paintings and to talk more about form and process. So that's really what we're going to be doing today. I was really struck when I first saw some of his paintings at the Locks Gallery in Philadelphia. I mean, after seeing reproductions of paintings like this one, Edge of Red, that we'll talk about later, I was expecting them to be more diffuse. I was not expecting an interesting surface. They kind of looked airbrushed or something like that. Nothing could be farther from the truth when I saw the processes that went into these paintings. And so I hope we can take you in close and get you to see what is possible. And of course, invite you to see the exhibition, part of the installation, which you're seeing here.
I mean, it might be fun to say at the outset that it's not every painting that engages us at so many different specific distances. There are plenty of paintings that you can kind of stand back and see them, or you want to see them up close. And these paintings in particular, I think, really reward a sort of interactive movement. There's a famous letter by the Impressionist painter Camille Pissarro, in which he talks about what is the optimum distance at which to look at a painting. And he talks about the diagonal of the format, that being the distance between you and the work. And that's often a good place to start. But I think especially as Nancy's pointed out, you have sometimes the impression at a distance in this installation shot of things that are exceedingly diffuse. And what's so much fun with some of these is that you get sort of drawn in. And in fact, there's a great deal to see, with your nose practically brushing the canvas. Joyce won't want that to actually happen. But to get in very, very close and see what's going on, especially at the edges, is a wonderful way of engaging with these paintings.
And if you haven't made it in to see the show yet, I'll just point to these installations here. There are a couple of them in the show, and they are these wonderful little sound, kind of floating sound booths without walls, where you can listen to some of Jane Rohr's poems. And there's some explanatory text there, but it's a lovely way of including the presence of the voice, the word, and of course, Jane's poetry in the exhibition. So we want to start with this early work. When Rohr is first starting out as a painter, I mean, we have to try to situate him in kind of the second half of the 20th century, a time when there's a lot of different kinds of abstract painting going on. And his first mode of working is smaller scale and extremely material, extremely heavy. And in fact, he's using a palette knife extensively in applying paint. This is called corn. And Christopher, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what a palette knife is and how this paint is laid down.
Well, if you're painting sort of in a traditional mode with a brush, there's only so much paint that you can put on a brush at one time. And so I think Rohrer at this point talked about not wanting to have to draw, that he wanted the shapes to come organically out of the material itself. And so he's using something called a painting knife. Painting knives have a long history. I mean, there's a very famous set of exchanges between Pissarro and Cezanne in the 1870s. They, in fact, were looking back at Courbet in the 1830s. But a painting knife is a small, flexible knife. Well, I really should have brought one. That allows you to mix paint on a palette, to scrape paint off a palette, but also to apply paint. And because it's thin and springy steel, you can load the rascal up and take it up and really kind of daub it on. You can think of it almost like a miniature bricklayer's trowel. And so Rohrer has built up this extraordinarily dense kind of coruscated material surface. I think we'll show you a detail in just a moment. And the palette knife is fascinating because, I mean, even Courbet showed us that you can sort of wield it in different ways and make almost anything, that he could make it sort of dance across a surface and generate textures of rock or sand or foam and spray. And so it can become very evocative. You can use it sort of like you were smearing cookie dough, because, you know, oil paint is really quite a thick, viscous thing coming out of the tube, in which case it's very rough. And you certainly see lots of that in the painting. But of course, the palette knife is also a smooth steel surface. And so it can be used like a trowel and can smooth across. And so you can have these two kinds of extremes of texture, which both, you know, hold and reflect light and color very differently right next to each other.
I mean, so we've got a palette here that is evocative of corn. We've got predominantly ochre tones, a little bit of green and brown. We might think of this blue passage as a blue sky, but we also might not, because the paint here is really calling attention to its materiality in a way that really takes our attention away from thinking about it as a representation of a landscape. And Rohrer even talks about not wanting to have a subject, that this working with the palette knife enabled him to evoke a natural landscape without making a subject. So the scale of it is very interesting in that way. He is, you know, of course, not the first to use a palette knife. And he's also, I think, responding to some tendencies in mid-20th century painting. Here's an example of Nicolas de Stael. It's called Fugue. It's from 1951-52, in which de Stael is painting in what he called tache. It's the French word for spot. And so you see this mode of composition that's really built out of these separate tache. And so Rohrer is really, you know, making this his own. You know, his painting doesn't look exactly like de Stael, but you see it responding to this particular kind of abstract painting that is more material oriented than, let's say, Jackson Pollock or de Kooning or some of the other gestural painters from the mid-20th century. So here, moving in close on corn, I don't know if, Christopher, you can point to some specific passages here where you see him wielding the palette knife in slightly different ways.
Well, I mean, somebody was asking about the size. Corn is 15 by 17 inches, so it's relatively small. And of course, you know, if you're going to load up a surface like this, this creates a whole different set of problems. Paintings on linen are an invention that goes back, you know, to the Renaissance as a lightweight, you know, support that's easily moved around. And a piece of stretched linen is really not in an appropriate kind of physical support to handle this kind of mass. And so Rohrer is actually using masonite panels. That's a kind of a pressed hardboard. You can find it, you know, a place like Lowe's or Home Depot. But think of a thin sort of 1/8 inch thick sheet of plywood, basically. in terms of its stiffness on which he can really layer this stuff. And I did. I'm here in my studio, so I just went and grabbed two painting knives. Can you see me, Nancy?
Yes.
When I'm speaking, yeah. So you see they're really quite springy and flexible. Here's a bigger one that one might typically use to mix up a batch of paint, but can also be used to apply. And I had mentioned, the texture of cookie dough. And when we think about oil paint, it's kind of important to actually, in thinking about paintings, to just sort of contemplate the physical stuff for a moment. Because oil paint comes out of the tube roughly the consistency of something like sour cream, just when it's been manufactured. An oil paint is not one of these things that's really complicated and has, 80 ingredients in it. Oil paint is basically a drying oil and dirt. Colored dirt ground into it very, very finely. And if you use an oil like olive oil, the paint is never going to dry. It's never going to be something that congeals and forms a surface. But if you use something like linseed oil is pulling in oxygen from the atmosphere, it's oxidizing, it's forming a film. And over the course of 100 years, that paint is going to go from the consistency of sour cream to being as brittle as glass. But it takes about 100 years to get there. So you can, obviously you can thin it with turpentine and put it on very thinly with a brush, or you can essentially trowel it on. And I think we're seeing in some of these big chunks in the middle that Rohrer has kind of troweled it on, and then he's done something to kind of smooth it out and make these kinds of plaques, what we're also calling tush, of paint, in which, because it's a smoother surface, it's a little more like picking up a rock at the shore of a lake and wetting it, that you're smoothing the surface and you can see the color. In smoothing it out, the roughness is reduced and the clarity of the color is kind of, exaggerated and brought to the surface.
So some of the 19th century artists who were interested in using a palette knife were trying to distance themselves from high levels of finish and kind of traditional illusionistic techniques, academic techniques. And they liked the fact that using the knife allowed for a rougher, freer kind of paint application that looked like an assault on tradition. Rohrer here is really using it more to lay on very thick plaques of paint. And you can see the irregularity of the edges of these areas where the paint has been kind of pressed down. I think that's one of the important points, that you end up with these areas that are kind of next to each other, not quite discrete, but very thick. Their irregularity is different in that sense from de Stijl's opting for something a little more rectangular or square in the Tash.
And I think it's worth kind of thinking too, just for a moment. I mean, this is already 1968, which is sort of, well past mid-century, but essentially ever since about 1950, when Pollock showed an entirely new paradigm of, I suppose we could call it opticality, of making enormous paintings that were, in a sense, dematerialized, that seemed to have no measurable presence on a surface in the way that these very much do, and yet which offered a kind of infinite space. I mean, in a sense, every artist post Pollock in America has had to sort of think about those paintings and how would one wish to take anything from them, or run the other way and do something utterly different and opposed. And the extraordinarily sort of dense materiality of this is exactly that, I think. I mean, it's precisely the opposite of a pure opticality of an address to eyesight alone. This is really something that you want to feel, you want to run your fingers across and handle.
So he doesn't want to stay in this heavy material mode forever, and he's beginning to think about working again on linen and in a sort of airier mode. And he hits upon this really interesting series that, doesn't last that long, but a series of shaped pictures. Now, these are panels. These are actually plywood panels. And so he conceived of hanging them with wires, just the way the Palmer has done here. But he's starting with an outline, a shape that is something observed. So this is called Shaped Panel, Two Clouds from 1969. So the shape of it is the cloud, but then on the surface of it, you see a very different kind of mark making from corn. You don't see that really heavy application. You see something that looks a little more like maybe a Bonnard or, a sort of late impressionist mode of mark or neo-impressionist mode of mark making. And you see him searching for a way of treating the picture in an all-over format. Now, that is something that many of the mid-20th century abstractionists were looking for. An artist like Pollock is really looking to treat the various corners and sides and ends of a composition similarly. So you don't have a composition that's centered on a figure, centered on some kind of a story or, heavy subject matter, but instead you've got a sort of even treatment all across the work. And so the Rohrer credits these shaped panels with moving him toward this all over mode of mark making. So that's a really fascinating transition. And here I'll show you, here's the other side. And so in the Palmer, you'll see this near the entrance to the exhibition. So on the other side, there's one of Jane's poems. And so the idea was to look at the cloud motif kind of in different seasons and to render the color, evocative of those different seasons.
And I think if I remember correctly, that this work was the precise shape of it. I mean, you have to think back, there's this terrible problem that every artist faces, every day in the studio. It's like, literally, what am I going to paint? And I love the fact that Rohrer speaks about this being a shape seen through a tree. So, there's, at least for myself, there's a sort of inherent feeling that what I don't want to do is be absolutely arbitrary. I mean, to create something that has no connection to anything or anybody, which one could easily do, and there certainly are artists who do interesting things like that, to me, that really just feels anathema. And so I think it's fascinating that Warren is sort of casting about for a mode in which to proceed, and suddenly looking at this negative shape formed by, who knows, the boundary of clouds and branches and the way the landscape was configured, so that it looks absolutely arbitrary. We could never begin to reconstruct the motif, but to him, there's a ground, there's something solid from which to start. And one can then take, a kind of phenomenological observation about colors and things in the world. And I think Nancy's comment about Bonnard is very good. There's a kind of high key, late impressionist, post-impressionist, very saturated color. I mean, that particular kind of malachite green in the center and lower left there, that's pretty much, right out of the tube, and the cobalt blue, that sort of thing. I mean, he's able to connect his experience of the world and yet put it in such a form that you can't quite make that connection. And so you're left in a sort of productive state of wonder and forced to look hard, which is, of course, one of the things that I think artists really want you to do.
So this is called Olive Grove, Corfu. It's from 1971. It's done at a moment of real transition for Rohrer. So in other words, he has done the shaped panels, and these end up, kind of hanging and, getting sold and all that, but he doesn't stick with that series for long. He has an opportunity to go to Europe, to visit many, many museums, to see the work of American artists abroad, as well as Renaissance artists, modern European artists. And so this is on canvas, and we see it at first as a kind of impressionist landscape. We're looking out at an olive grove, so we see tree trunks and branches and a traditional landscape. The facture is, of course, very interesting, but at one level, it is like an impressionist painting in that he's obviously looking at a motif and rendering what is seen. But of course, he's gone back and started to think about taking it out of that realm of being nothing but a record of what is seen. It is pushing toward something more abstract. And by that, I mean an abstraction from nature, not a non-representational painting, which I don't think Rohrer was ever very interested in, even if most of his mature paintings are quite abstract. So we have to think in terms of abstraction from nature. In terms of the departures from what he's looking at, I would point you toward the mark making up here, this back and forth motion of the brush. It forms a kind of decorative border. Here, he's gone in and kind of used the other end of the brush or a stylus, to actually kind of carve into the paint and make these lines here. He's created a bit of a border to the right. And Christopher, you had some observations about the lower end of the painting, if you wanted to chime in what you see happening down here.
Well, the organization of the painting is really interesting, I think, because it's very much a record of sort of thought in progress, as opposed to being in a kind of known state and executing a work. I mean, if we think about, what do groves and orchards typically look like, that they typically have a kind of order. There may be a regular interval between the tree trunks and that sort of thing. And so in the center, we feel to some extent, there is a kind of patchwork geometry. But there's a very curious thing has happened that, instead of ever having the view through and over the trees, it's as though the ground plane has kind of been tipped up on us. And Rohrer is getting to the edge of the painting, and he's starting to kind of think about the support. And, Cezanne, again, is one of the artists who sort of has the most interesting and intricate relationships between the orientation of marks internally and the geometry of the support. I mean, we have this given of a rectangular slab that artists tend to paint on. And, this slab has 90-degree corners. It has this kind of orthogonal geometry. We could think of it as sort of the horizontal line of the sea or, the distant landscape. And then there's the verticality of things, growing against gravity, of the way a tree stands, the way a person stands on the earth. So you have these two axes. And this is, of course, a painting that Rohrer probably knew. This is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's a Cezanne from about 1874 called Quartier Four. And I think it's fascinating to see the areas in which Cezanne too, and this is a fairly early work for him, is grappling with this question of, how do I organize this plane? The world is rather more chaotic than it finally appears in paintings. And so there's a whole series of decisions. So Cezanne is grabbing on to the planar geometry of houses and their overlap at the beginning. He's kind of painting up the hillside a little bit the way Rohrer is in Corfu. And perhaps most interestingly, look at the kind of upper border where there's, I'm sure, this, kind of chaotic seeing of bits of sky through the very complex network of leaves and branches. And so Cezanne is reaching here for a kind of a unit mark. The leaf representations are all sort of a brush mark of the same size, and they're starting to kind of align in ways with the edge of the painting. Let's pop back to the Corfu for a minute. And Nancy was pointing out, as you saw, I mean, that there's a very consistent rhythm, a kind of wristy rhythm that's producing that green band across the top there. And even, the relationship of that band to the edge, it stays perfectly parallel. It's like he's acknowledging the shape and the format of the support, using it and allowing it to kind of work as a structure internally. And of course, by this time, I imagine Rohrer would have seen in magazines like Artforum, or perhaps in New York, works by people like Frank Stella, who are going in absolutely geometric directions and who are allowing shaped canvases to dictate internal intervals, something that gets called deductive structure. So in a way, the consistent brown border at the bottom, the green band at the top, these are kind of interesting echoes of the format. And I even noticed, if you look closely, I don't know how well it shows on your screen, there's a very curious set of sort of finishing marks. I'm always, as an artist, aware of what is it that gets done at the very end? What is it that somebody feels is necessary to kind of finish a work? There's a whole series of red or pinkish dots that run across. And they're in these regular intervals. I mean, this is an absolutely kind of arbitrary set of marks. Maybe there were some pink flowers in the foreground, but Rohrer decides to make a kind of graphical interval out of it, which is a really interesting decision there.
So this painting is not in the show. It is in our catalog essay. In the show, you'll see a few canvases that are done in this, kind of quasi-impressionist mode. So I just wanted to prepare you for that. But these dots that Christopher just spoke of, just kind of hold them in your mind, because the next painting we come to is Barley from 1972. So like, we wouldn't have this kind of treatment of a large canvas without the shaped panels, without the idea of an all over treatment of the shaped panels. We also wouldn't have it without the dots that you just saw in Olive Grove Corfu. But you'll also feel like, hey, we're in a whole different world here. We're not looking at a landscape with a horizon line and trees and sky, while the title, and to some extent the palette, is evocative of grain, and so one thinks of fields. We're looking at something really much more abstract, and we need to think about how a painting like this can be evocative of landscape, and how the painter is even thinking about the picture plane, what we call the picture plane. So, I mean, people use this term picture plane, and it can often be very confusing. A picture plane is not the picture surface. The picture plane is like a window that the artist is looking through. The artist is giving you a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional world. We're meant to feel as if we're kind of looking through a window, or perhaps in a mirror. So that's true of Cezanne. That's true of Olive Grove Corfu. I mean, Cezanne gives us a little bit of a barrier here. We're kind of aware that, well, we're here and the landscape is out there, but the window, the picture plane window, is in a vertical orientation, just like a window. When we get to the early 20th century, to Monet's late work, and this is one of his Water Lilies panels from the Museum of Modern Art. So this is like 1914 to 26. The picture plane for Monet is no longer a window that you're looking through that's in a vertical orientation. The picture plane is starting to kind of tip down toward this pond that is becoming his subject here, this large pond that is both reflecting the sky. You know, we see reflections of clouds, reflections of the color, the blue color of the sky, but we're also seeing the lily pads that are on the surface of the water. And we're sometimes even looking into the water and seeing the algae and the undergrowth underwater. So we're seeing a whole mixture of things, but we're also immersed in a world that is not a simple window view. And I think we've made quite a leap when we, go from Olive Grove, Corfu to this Barley picture, and it's worth thinking about the kind of philosophical justification for this new orientation, because this really is going to become a consistent mode for Rohrer, even with many other changes that he's going to go through.
It's amazing when you think of it that this is basically, within a year or so. I mean, 71, 72, and Barley is 72. And I think Nancy bringing in the Monet is interesting, because Monet, the big late Monets were kind of discounted. And the fact that there was a cycle to be seen in New York at the Museum of Modern Art was tremendously important, to the mid-century painters and later. Joan Mitchell used to tell a story about going to the Monet studio at Giverny and climbing, over a fence and going into the studios, which were unlocked, unloved, not being preserved, birds flying around, pooping on the canvases, and standing there with other artists like Ellsworth Kelly and looking at those big paintings. And scale really comes into it. I mean, you go even to the relatively small cycle at MoMA, and that's still a huge painting. I mean, it's wrapping around several walls. And Rohrer is making a big jump in scale here from, paintings that are typically 1.5 feet wide to something like this, which is almost 5 feet wide. And it's also, I think, telling that we're suddenly looking at squares, that Rohrer works from landscape, but he's getting tired of people sort of seeing landscape in everything he does. And so how to kind of break loose. One way is to take away that the kind of the horizontality of the horizon line and go with the kind of perfect geometry of the square. And in a sense, to take multiple systems of mark making that we've seen in the work up to this point, simplify it down into a kind of a color field and a set, multiple sets of kind of imprints on top. And in that simplification, yes, there's a certain complexity is let go, but a certain power is gained in exchange.
I mean, it's often been said by, critics like Clement Greenberg that, modernism is all about kind of purity of medium. And certainly one sees an emphasis on medium in Rohrer's work. But the kind of mark making that you see over and over in the paintings that are in the exhibition, it's patient, it's slow, it's repetitive. You see variations, places where the paint load is a little bit heavier and where the paint load is a little bit lighter. There's a row going along and it's perfectly straight, and then it kind of dips a little bit. The purple dabs here, some of them are a little bigger, a little darker than others. And so we become aware of a more organic process, a more handmade, laborious, kind of hand-driven process, calligraphic process that is also pushing the medium to its limits. It's not just saying, oh, well, this is all about painting. It's not about painting. It is about engaging with the world. It's about Barley, a field, agriculture, the landscape of Lancaster County, where he's from. But it's trying to make that into a work of art that also can stand as a creation and not a mere record, not a mere copy of something seen. But that pushing of the medium is something that I think we'll see again and again. I mean, we see that certainly in Monet. We brought in a couple of details of the water lilies just so you could see something of the gestural marks, you know, the kind of scumbling on the surface, the layering of paint, and the extent to which when you walk up close to this large Monet, you know, kind of this is what you're seeing. You really are immersed in a visual field. I mean, that introduces a whole set of questions for mid-20th century American artists. You know, is your painting meant to be seen up close or at a distance, as Christopher was asking at the beginning of the talk? And so a painting like White Wheat, I think, is a perfect example for that kind of question. From a distance, it looks pristine, you know, kind of electric yellow against a softer yellow. And up close, you're more aware of the patient mark making and the hand labor, the slight irregularity of it. It's not some sort of decorative abstraction that's just meant to be a pattern. It's more evocative of, you know, putting seeds in a row that, you know, you're trying for something that's basically straight, but there are irregularities. But we see a certain difference between barley and white wheat. It's only the difference of a year. This is 1973. But that square mode and larger format is definitely working for him.
Artists, I mean, like, to go back to Frank Stella for a minute, we're really discovering that as you simplify means, you allow a sort of concentration on very small changes in procedure and material that have quite significant perceptual effects. If we could go to the detail there, Nancy. I mean, Stella noted very famously in the black paintings that merely the direction of the brush going across the surface would change the kind of sheen and reflectivity and the look of the paint. And I think it's fascinating to look here in these details, that the fact that Rohrer is making his marks in a very precise and repetitive mode, that if you look closely, you can see, for instance, along the right border, that each of those little sort of matchstick shaped marks is heaviest at the bottom. So the paintbrush has touched down in the middle and made a stroke. You know, we don't know what orientation. It might have been even worked flat on stretchers or something on trestles in the studio, but the mark has been absolutely consistent in its direction. And so every one thins out slightly in the same way. And that by making exceedingly small adjustments, that quite a lot happens visually, that in the sort of four vertical bands on the left, those matchstick-like marks either overlap or are nearly allowed to overlap with just hairlines of that bright kind of lemon yellow field underneath. Whereas on the extreme right-hand edge, there's more space between them. And when, let's just pop back, Nancy, to the whole painting. I mean, you get this quite complicated sort of optically vibrating field out of the fact that all of those fine adjustments have been made, that those little hairlines are showing that, you know, the difference in 0.5 millimeter of yellow pigment makes it one patch or the other. And he's clearly not, you know, using giant, you know, straight edges and rulers, that he's allowing these things to take on a certain handmade, organic kind of shifting. You think about what it looks like to look out over a plowed field, that, you know, the land in a farm is never perfectly flat, that you see the furrows and the contours kind of tracking and taking on a certain organic character, even within their regularity. And of course, that's exactly, I think, what we see here in white wheat.
So in 1973, there's an exhibition of Agnes Martin's work at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. And Rohrer is able to meet with Agnes Martin. Her work is an interesting reference point for Rohrer because she does opt for a square format, fairly large format. She is someone who uses a ruler, but one is aware of the extent to which she would lay a ruler down to make a mark, but then carry the ruler across the canvas to continue the line. And so there are irregularities, places where the line is no longer perfectly straight. And so that kind of handmade slight irregularity is a quality you're very much aware of. You're also very aware of the fact that she uses graphite mixed with the oil paint. You often have a very, very subtle set of colors and graphite marks in a grid on an Agnes Martin that's somewhat like the kind of slightly irregular lines and very subtle palette, bright but subtle differences, subtle, white on yellow, yellow on yellow, that you have in a Rohrer. So this is called Falling Blue. It's from 1963. It's one painting that was in the exhibition that Rohrer saw.
I love the fact that Agnes Martin grew up in the wheat fields of Saskatchewan. And if you've ever stood out in the wheat fields in the Midwest of America or Canada, to see all of those, literally billions of stalks, moving in the wind, each its own little line, each, with its kind of organic perturbations, it's a very rich sort of connection between these two. Nancy, I see that the time is really getting along on us here.
Yeah, we should move along. So we're getting into the more abstract works now, like Edge of Red from 1983. And we have a couple of details, but this is one where you're less concerned with the landscape referent, and I think more drawn into Rohrer's process, because what looks like a fairly simple gradient from a distance up close is not only incredibly subtle, but Rohrer deliberately leaves the edges somewhat raw, where you see more of his process and you see more of the layers that went into it. I don't know if Christopher, you want to tell us kind of what went down first here?
Well, I actually, it's a little hard to see, although it looks like perhaps we had basically a red field. But there were a number of artists working in the 70s who used the edge to kind of create an extraordinary degree of access to what's going on. I'm thinking of some of Bryce Marden's works. And in these works of Rohrer's, that he's almost given you the sort of a key to looking at the piece, that if you start to wonder when you're 10 feet back, how in the world can you get this kind of, evanescent, kind of boiling and yet very calm sort of gradient of color? I mean, the answer is to be found looking up close. Let's see some of those other details, that you have a sort of a field color underneath, and then you start to sort of tune it in one direction or another, that if there's dark green, you're going to kind of lower the saturation of the red, you're going to take the overall tonality down. The bright kind of cadmium orange is going to do one thing, and then there's this extraordinary, kind of cross-hatching, this quilt of color that's laid down over the top, in which absolutely irregular marks with no, consistent orientation, so different from what we had just seen, is laid down as a veil but with just enough openness to see the color underneath. And of course, that's a technique that Matisse had very famously used at the turn of the century. They're very often, the really luminous passages of Matisse are created by having, not just a color, but a color and two and maybe a third overlaid on top, so that there's a kind of optical mixing that's happening, and you get this extraordinarily complex effect. Really a beautiful thing.
Maybe, Carrie, we could take some questions now.
Great. Yeah, we have one question from Julia, who writes, 1971 was also the Whitney Quilt Exhibition. Have you thought about the shape and scale of quilts in relation to this jump in the early 70s in terms of size?
Well, there are some Rohrer paintings that have a square in the center that really are based more clearly on the composition of Amish quilts. And we didn't discuss those paintings in our essay, but the kind of process that Christopher was just describing for a picture like this, even if the final surface layer is more of a gradient that is more evocative of, let's say, sky, not literally, but kind of changing tonalities in an atmosphere or in a sky. There is still a kind of two-dimensional textile quality to that surface, as we see here. Even if it's irregular, there is a weaving together of marks to create an overall screen or tissue of surface that has a lot in common with the surface of a textile. And so it's not unthinkable, or it's not, hard to understand how Rohrer could be responding both to Amish quilts in some of his paintings and to fields of grain in other paintings.
And productively both at the same time. Yeah.
If I can just dive in here, am I hearable?
Yes.
Oh, good. So it's Chris Reed back here again. Another connection that I think is interesting is the scale of these big paintings, which somebody asked about. They're about the size of an arm span, which means they're also about the size of a person. And that was also one of those kind of ideas in the 60s. I think it was Ad Reinhardt who talked about the big square as being human sized. And I think that's a kind of interesting connection to the quilts that actually we haven't talked about before, is this, they're the kind of scale of the body lying down, arms spread out, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man kind of idea of a single unit, which I think connects. You talked so beautifully about the setting up the unit of the tache or the brush mark in those earlier paintings. And of course, these paintings are all, structured with little kind of units, but in some ways, like the big unit, the painting itself is a person, which I think is a kind of interesting connection.
And I think in that sense, very much not sort of these, vast galaxy-sized paintings like some of the big Pollocks, that are 18 and 22 feet across. That this does bring it back. I think that's a very good observation, really to human scale, very, very beautifully.
It is interesting that he works in this diptych format here. This is called Untitled 3, 1993. And so these are two canvases that are meant to be one painting, one painting with two parts, almost musical in that sense. And so, these are certainly a move more into abstraction than the field language paintings are. Nevertheless, one sees at the lower edge here some gestures that are like those calligraphic marks evocative of individual stalks that we see in some of the others.
I think too, it's fascinating how all you have to do is put two squares together, and visually we start we connect them, and it starts to feel more like landscape, like it feels like the breadth of looking out at the fields. And we even have effects, I mean, something almost like Leonardo's atmospheric perspective, where there's a kind of, you know, diminution of the intensity and saturation of color into gray, as though, you know, fog was settling in over the fields. And we have these wonderful marks at the bottom, where it looks to me, I should have looked more closely when I was in the show last time. It looks to me as though after laying down quite a kind of greasy, heavy paint layer, that Rohrer may have used his finger there and just kind of, you know, cut through to make some shapes that maybe were there and got covered up. And again, those shapes have a kind of organic flavor. I mean, we're going to see something in just a moment where it was specific to, you know, the shapes of corn stalks left in the fall after the harvest. But I think, you know, to look for just a moment at the quality of that surface. And Nancy, let's see that next image. To think
we have
about
Roysdale.
yeah, that's what I wanted, was the
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, you want the Roysdale?
yeah, sure, let's have that. I mean, what a strange thing oil paint is, you know, that it was used by somebody like Jacob van Ruysdael in you know, around 1670 to create this, you know, absolute illusion of immense depth and space. I mean, that how can you put something greasy on a surface that's right in front of your nose and create as much volume as possible? And that Rohrer, in a sense, is enjoying doing absolutely the opposite here, of making this dense impastoed surface and then kind of inscribing into it with instruments, with fingers, whatever.
Carrie, were there other questions you wanted to bring in, or?
We have one question in the chat, and I believe Professor Reed left a response, but I think it only went to the panelists. But the question is, speaking of scale, did Warren ever paint larger than a 5-foot square?
Boy, I don't remember seeing anything much larger than that at the Locke's Gallery, but I don't really know.
Chris, do you know the answer to that? You need to unmute.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was only sending it to the panelists. I thought I was chatting with everyone here. So yeah, as I underlined your point that of course the big diptychs are one piece and they get very wide, but the individual units of the each canvas, I said exactly what Christopher just said. I think the biggest we've seen is 72 by 72 inches. Oh, and here I see that John Rohrer, Warren Rohrer's son, has weighed in to say 6 feet were the biggest.
72.
And so yeah, they remain on this kind of human scale that we've been talking about. And as Christopher was saying, I mean, it's a really self-conscious contrast with the really ginormous paintings of somebody like Pollock, or before that, the late Monets.
So we'll just show you, we brought in a few images of some of the works on paper. So this one is in the exhibition. It's called Palm 8 from 1994. It's graphite on paper, and here's a detail of it. So it's wonderful that the exhibition includes sketchbooks. It includes many of the large paintings, but also some of these sizable works on paper where you can appreciate the mark making that much more directly. One that Christopher and I studied at the Locke's Gallery, so this is not in the exhibition, but it's discussed in our essay, is called Untitled 2 from the early 90s, 90 to 94. It's gouache and graphite on paper, but it's a rubbing that was made on cherry bark. So he actually starts out putting the paper on the bark and making a kind of rubbing, and then working it over with the gouache, which is an opaque white that is, it's like watercolor, but more opaque and more matte. So really covering, yet not completely covering, that the signs of that rubbing mark with these very small gestures like the ones that we were seeing in Barley and some of the other large paintings from the early 70s.
Nancy, if we could go back to the detail, just one big private. I think this is such an interesting thing that if you think about the act of taking a piece of rag paper out and wrapping it around a cherry tree, I mean, one thing that you could do would be to just start slavishly starting at one corner and work your way across the paper. Because of course the cherry tree is, you know, in a sense, uniformly textured all the way around. And yet Rohrer is thinking in his intervals about working very selectively from the world and organizing those sensations. And so he, you know, is passing his pencil across a little patch of bark, and then he skips a unit and he goes to the next. And he's keeping his rows and his columns, you know, again, a sort of almost agricultural geometry applied to this potentially all over surface. And it generates this extraordinary, you know, pattern of organization.
I mean, in that sense, it's even responding to an aesthetic we see in minimalist art from the 1960s about the intervals between the units being as important as the units themselves. And of course, that was another approach to changing the way we think about composition in art, to kind of de-hierarchize a composition. We thought it would be fun, since we're talking about Rohrer making marks, to show you an image of Christopher making some marks, and just sort of remind everyone what it means to look at a landscape and to work with materials and to think about a set of marks that would in some way be connected to the representation of a landscape.
I mean, there is something very special about being out in the landscape. And I think it's fascinating that Rohrer kept sketchbooks, went out, made drawings, made rubbings. I mean, so that there's a kind of constant exchange between the phenomenological world, material world, and the studio. And I find I often at least want to get things started outside. And so I end up working outside at various points, or 12 months of the year. And that there's a kind of a power, a kind of inspiration, a kind of freshness that gets brought along in that way, even though it can sometimes be difficult. You could show the next one there, Nancy. I mean, the day that I did this was actually in February, and I decided I wanted to shoot a little video, and that video is going to be available and to be seen quite soon. It was actually snowing like mad. So what you're seeing there is a glass palette where I have my sticks and powdered graphite and safflower oil and some white oil paint and a big painting blade that I'm working with. And it's also covered with snow. So there was this really weird, crunchy texture to laying down the paint that made a different sound and a different sort of mark. And it was quite fascinating, something I really quite enjoyed.
So here's one of the finished works of Christopher's. So, I mean, I think, again, we can talk about marks that are made in response to something seen, and marks that are made that are independent of what is seen. You know, it's something that you see in Rohrer as well.
I think you can see why I was an obvious pick to think about and write about Rohrer, that we really have certain kind of deep kinships.
Well, we definitely wanted to show you this one, Field Language 3 from 1990, just because the calligraphic marks are so distinctive, evocative of stalks in a field, but they're also gestures in a painting. And it's fascinating to see the different scales of these different gestures. This kind of medium scale here, these very larger, very much larger shapes here, and this lower register where Rohrer has made an entirely different kind of set of marks.
It's fun to see, in a sense, everything coming together in some of these late works. The shapes brought in from the fields, the dense fields of color laid down and then overworked on the top. Marks that felt to me when I first saw them like marks made from the cherry bark rubbings, kind of writ large and turned into a whole inscriptive language across the surface. That part corn and things of all different scales happening. And I think it's one of the reasons I was suggesting that these paintings really require a kind of back and forth where you look at the overall from a distance and then you want to go up very, very close and see what's happening in each quadrant, because it's different everywhere.
Carrie, were there other questions we should take before we wrap up?
We had one last question that I kind of answered in the Q&A, but it's, do we have any written scholarship on the progressions of Rohrer's work artistically? So I gave a shout out as well to the exhibition catalog with your essay, as well as some other exhibition catalogs of his work and from the Locks Gallery. But if there's anything else that maybe you'd like to add.
Yeah, Chris Reed, did you want to?
I think our catalog is the place to go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very, very much, Christopher and Nancy. That was really wonderful. It was such a pleasure to slow down, look at the work, really get involved in the kind of mark making. And you are both so articulate. I know that there are poets in the group, so I'm really hoping somebody will write a poem on Christopher's phrase, wristy rhythm. That seems like a good place to start to me. And I want to really thank you for all of your contributions to the exhibition, to the catalog, and to this programming.
Well, thank you for inviting us. One last point I wanted to make. I had a solo painting show scheduled for April in New York, which was obviously postponed. So we're going to do, since there's still no date yet, an online exhibition that's going to debut on April 6th. There's a QR code and a URL there. If you follow the link, you will get on an email list. We'll send you an invitation to the exhibition for April 6th.
And once again, March 31st, the Rohrer Show reopens, and we're looking forward to that very much. So thank you, Chris, and thanks everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you everyone for attending. Please be sure to check out our other museum conversations coming up related to this exhibition, and mark your calendars for those. You can reserve your tickets for the exhibition and the other exhibitions up at the Palmer through the Palmer's website. So get your time ticket.
Okay. Thank you.